Your aim or your mechanical skill is the most important thing to climb in Marvel Rivals. You see, regardless of the positions you take or how well you understand the game, if you can't hit a single shot or land an ability, you cannot execute consistent plays and you will not climb. That's why in this video, we're gonna go over tips and tricks to develop insane mechanics as quickly as possible. So we're gonna break it all down. But if you want guided help, definitely check out the Marvel Rivals Academy. We got Coach Scrim's guided help and it's 30 days of free coaching. So check it out risk-free down below, and also check me out on stream Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. We like to have a good time, answer any questions you might have, so definitely check me out down below and let's get into it. Now, the first question a lot of people have is, what is the best sensitivity? And we're going to talk about the PC and the controller's specifics on this one. The reality is there isn't a perfect sensitivity, but that doesn't mean that any sensitivity goes most of the time. What do I actually mean by that? Well, for PC specifically, there is a ballpark range that the majority of pros operate around. It is about at 800 DPI and 3 in-game sense is the average for the majority of pros that I have researched. Now, me personally, I rock 800 at 1.85, which is almost half that, but I'm honestly rocking a really low sensitivity relative to Marvel Rivals, and most people operate much higher than me. Going back to that 800 at 3 or 1600 at 1.5, that's about the average, and this means that this is probably the ballpark for the majority of people's sensitivity, and there are going to be a couple exceptions, but the reason that I give you the ballpark is one of the things I see the most when analyzing people's sensitivities and seeing what people have as their starting sensitivity just in the dark is that they'll have 4, 5, 6, 7 times what the average is for pro players. And I'm not saying that you can't have something that is outside the realm of normacy, but what I am saying is that most of the time this indicates that you haven't actually looked into your sensitivity. You haven't researched it, you haven't found the proper sensitivity for you, and you're playing something that is really, really too high for you. And while there are going to be some people that actually are better at high sensitivity and prefer it, it's really a dramatically small amount of people in comparison. I'm talking like 1% of people, and this has been pretty consistent throughout most shooter games. And one of the things that I like to say when you're trying to find a great sensitivity on mouse and keyboard, I want you to think of your arm as a brush. This means that you're using your arm as a big, large brush, like if you're painting a canvas. Then you're using your wrist as a smaller brush to get some of those mid strokes, you know, the mid-size objects. And then you're using your fingers to be that little tiny brush to get the finer details in. What this means is that if you have a sensitivity that allows you to use your arm, your wrist, and your fingers, you have different parts of your arm that are going to be used for different parts of the painting, as opposed to having a sense so high that you're just slightly moving your wrist or slightly moving your fingers and it's going across the entire screen. And you also don't have a sensitivity so low that you're not trying to paint little tiny intricacies or small things on a canvas with a giant paintbrush or your arm. Now, the thing about it is there is going to be hero specific differences when trying to find that sensitivity. And this is also where I want to talk about controller, because I think it matters more for controllers. Certain heroes are going to require different types of sensitivity, and you can actually have either different sensitivity for different characters or just have an optimal sensitivity for the heroes that you play if you play heroes that are kind of similar in how they operate. And let me give you an example. If they're more precise in nature, characters that need really fine mechanical alteration, really trying to hit headshots and things like that, you know, let's take Punishers or Hellas. Of course, your sensitivity is going to be on the lower side because you're going to want to be more fine-tuned. You're going to want to be able to very easily move pixel by pixel, and that's typically why hit scan players especially have lower than average sensitivity. But if you're playing characters like Black Panther, for instance, then you are actually preferring a higher sensitivity, so you can move around faster and you don't have to be as pinpoint precise as the headshot hitting pixel Hella players, but you want to have an increase in that movement. So like with controller, you would have maxed out sensitivities as well, and for mouse and keyboard, you would also have higher than average sensitivities. And now also tank players can also have higher than average sensitivities as well, because they don't need to be as precise, but it kind of depends on the tanks that you play and also your personal preference as well. In general, for controller over mouse and keyboard, I would actually recommend having specific sensitivities and settings for specific characters more so. And for PC, I think it's actually fine either way. It's your personal preference. Now, the next question I get a lot when it comes to aim is, what equipment is actually worth buying that's going to make you a better mechanical player? First off, let's talk about PC. Mouse, is that worth buying? Absolutely yes. I think the number one thing that you should step away from is that old mouse that your mother used that was just like a hardwired, really old archaic mouse. No, what you really want for Rivals is just a pure FPS mouse. And what this means is typically low weight or reasonably low weight, like 100 grams or less. Oftentimes you go way lower than that. But what's important here mainly is that you have a mouse that is designed for aiming over utility. Like there's a lot of mice that have a million buttons on them, and typically they're used for MMOs or MOBAs, right? And the reason that they're used for that is because you can have like a mouse with a lot of different buttons on it and a ton of weight on it and extra pressure that you're adding to different sides of the mouse. Because keep in mind, when you're pressing a button on the mouse as you're aiming, you're actually adding a variable that you wouldn't normally have. You know, if I'm slamming a mouse on the right side of my mouse while flicking to the right, I might not be aiming as consistently as I otherwise would. And that's why typically I actually recommend not having anything bound to your mouse if you can. But when it comes to an FPS mouse, you're kind of stripping away all those crazy buttons and things like that just for a pure aiming experience that is kind of unimpeded by all these extra buttons and things that can actually mess up your aim. And so I would recommend any mouse that is made for shooters. I use the G Pro, not a sponsor. It's just the most popular pro mouse, but you can use pretty much any mice you want to. And yes, 100% it is worth it and basically a necessity if you want to take aiming seriously. Now, on the controller side, most controllers work, and I think that they are perfectly fine, but of course, you're not going to want a secondhand controller with a lot of stick drift. You're not going to want a really old controller that has all these problems. I think just having a consistent, performer, high quality equipment is always something that I would recommend in general. Now, as far as frames are concerned, you always want as many frames as possible when playing a shooter, period. The more frames, the better. And this means that if you have a PC that can run it, you really want to have 144 hertz minimum, I would say. And that's not going to be realistic for everyone. I know the game doesn't run that well. Like it only gets like 200 frames per second on my pretty juiced out computer, but higher frames is going to give you a smoother experience. It's going to be overall better. When I was grinding Overwatch back in the day, when I jumped from 60 to 144 hertz, it was just night and day. It was like a completely different experience. And for a lot of you players that are on console, you can also play at a higher frame rate. So depending on what your console is and what that frame rate is, whether it's 120 or whatever, you want to get either a TV or a monitor or whatever that matches that. And you typically want to have only 1 millisecond response time. So this is going to mean a really seamless experience, a higher quality experience, a more fluid experience. You're going to be able to aim better, react better. And overall, it's just matching what you can have in the game, whatever that consistent FPS is, to your monitor so you can experience that higher refresh rate. So yeah, this is like one of the number one things I recommend. If you have the capability to, definitely get it. And especially for you PC players, I highly recommend it. And also make sure you enable it in the display settings. I had friends that have played on 60 frames for like years, even though they had a 144 hertz monitor. They didn't even know. Make sure you turn it on. Now, for a mouse pad, I think that a mouse pad is one of the least important pieces of equipment you could buy. Like, it's still important, but it's not as important. I used to rock like a freaking card game playmat, a Magic the Gathering playmat for the longest time. Now I rock an Artisan or a Kurosun, and I really like these mouse pads. Like, they're really nice and high quality, and they feel really good. And I highly recommend Artisan, and I highly recommend other mouse pads. So yeah, still a very important thing, but I think that like having any mouse pad is like reasonable, and then you could upgrade from there and get a higher quality one. Not a make or break, but I mean, you can get a pretty cheap Artisan on Amazon, so I would just recommend that. The next thing that we got to talk about is about aim trainers. There's aim trainers for console, there's aim trainers for PC. When does aim training actually matter? What does aim training actually do? Who is it for? Is it useful at all? Is it a waste of time? What is aim training? Now, aim training is a way to practice the raw mechanics of aim in an isolated environment. So even though you're not going to be able to perfectly replicate the conditions in game, aim training can be really good for getting reps of very specific types of aim, whether that is tracking based aim, flicking based aim, certain things that can be replicated in your games, but at a very hyper focused level or just a really high volume. That's what aim trainers are really for. And there's things that you could do like Control Sphere and Whiz Sphere that I think could be really helpful for Marvel Rivals in particular. Those are specifically Kovac drills, but there's also some in Aim Labs as well. And here's ultimately who are the people that I think benefit the most from aim trainers. I think brand new people that are really trying to develop their aim, they don't have great aim or great aim fundamentals. I think aim trainers can really help those people more than anyone else because they can just kind of get really comfortable comfortable with their controller, really comfortable with their mouse, really kind of figure things out and learn how to be a relatively good aimer. The other group of people that I think it really helps to do aim training with are people that have already gotten fairly good at aiming, or as good as they will get through large volumes of play. So I've basically have reached my natural limit, in my opinion, where my aim hasn't really gotten that much better over the past 2 years. For a long time, my aim was really bad. Then after playing a lot, my aim started developing quite a bit. And then I kind of have gotten to the point where I'm not really improving day to day. Like, I don't see any major improvement day to day, even week to week. And honestly, you compare my aim from last year to this year, it's pretty much the same. And that's why recently I started aim training more, and I really get to focus on the areas that I'm lacking the most, and I can push past the certain ceiling. I think that that's really where aim training can really help players that have kind of reached that natural ceiling, and from here on they need more guided practice or specific practice in order to further develop their aim. It's because there's always like levels of aim, and if you look at the pro players, they have very consistent, reliable, and insane aim, so you want to be able to follow suit with that, and the only way you're going to get there is through specific practice. Now, the reason that I think that aim trainers aren't the only thing that you need to practice, and the reason that I think it's not good for everybody, is aim training doesn't practice something that's very important about hero shooters, and that's aiming under pressure. Like, there's a huge difference between shooting something when you're under no pressure and shooting something that is moving, trying to move to dodge you. You're trying to move to dodge them, and you're at the fear of death because you have to move to kind of mitigate damage while at the same time trying to hit shots that if you miss, you could die. So one of the things I actually recommend is the Doom Patrol match. I think sometimes some of the matches are troll, but when you get a real match where people are actually trying to kill each other, trying to play, I think it's a good place to, actually fight under pressure. And if you can't, just run a random one and it's not competitive enough, get a couple of your friends together that are also trying to improve their aim and join a free-for-all Doom Patrol match together and all really try very hard, sweat really hard, and just practice some of these mechanical actions more. Practice actually trying to get kills, take it seriously, and you're gonna get better that way. And then of course in comp, one of the things I always recommend to people is try to hit the hard shots. I think there's a lot of players that go for the easy shots all the time. They keep whiffing the critical, they keep ripping the headshot, so they're gonna settle for a body shot, and they never really push themselves to go for the harder shot. And maybe they're trying to play for like a certain accuracy stat or something along those lines, but the only way to get better is to push yourself and try for the hard thing. That's the only way to push your aim and push that consistency. This might make you worse in the moment going for these crits, but it will make you better in the long run, so I highly recommend it. Now, flicking versus tracking, what's better? Am I flicking to targets or am I tracking? What does this actually mean? Now, for one, this is going to be partially hero based. So the idea here is that some characters are going to be tracking more. You're going to be tracking a lot more on these characters because there's a continuous flow of fire. Characters like Star-Lord that have a continuous flow of fire. Characters like Punisher are going to have a continuous flow of fire. But other characters like Hela, for example, are going to have precise click point of fire. You're not constantly necessarily looking at a target and shooting them the whole time. You're shooting them at key intervals. Now, does this mean that you're not tracking them at all? No, of course you can track them, and you can even play in a way that just follows them until you're ready to fire. And then the idea here is that you're flicking as little as possible. And here's like the golden rule. The longer you have to flick, like the further the distance you have to flick, the harder the shot is going to be. So even in a character that is like a Black Widow or like a Hela, you don't want to set yourself up to have to flick across your screen. You still want to put your crosshair as close as possible. And then for tracking based, oftentimes you're following the target. And of course, you can practice specific different types of aim with specific aim training, but it's important to understand the difference. Now, some players actually prefer to flick a lot more, get the crosshair relatively close, but always flick to the head. And other players prefer to just follow the target. A lot of that is personal preference and also the character that you play as well. And I would say, once again, in every game, this matters. Crosshair placement, which is just putting your crosshair head level, making it so that you have to move as little as possible, and your crosshair's already set up appropriately to get free damage across. Like with Bucky, you're putting your crosshair to where you can just kind of spam down lane and still hit dinks. Move your crosshair really little, have it to where when you hook someone in, you don't have to move your crosshair all that much, if at all. This is all going to make your shots easier on you, so you don't actually have to, flick around like crazy. In general, the less you have to move, the easier your shots are going to be, which is going to be better overall. Now, something that you should also be aware of is that a lot of players will have certain side bias where they're good at flicking in certain directions. They're better at flicking right, they're better at flicking left, they're better at aiming left and right, and they're not as good at aiming up and down. You need to make sure you're practicing that. I think a lot of people practice the horizontal aim, but they don't practice the vertical aim as much. It makes it harder for you to hit flyers when you don't practice that as much. And then, you know, left to right, right to left, you want to be, you know, as consistent. If a person's to the left of your crosshair, you want to be just as consistent flicking to them as a person to the right of your crosshair. You got to make sure to practice that consistency. I think a lot of these parallels kind of, you know, parallel working out in the gym, which is kind of interesting, but this is kind of what this is for specifically aiming. Now, another thing I want to go over is the relationship between movement and aim, because movement directly affects aim, and it's really important to understand exactly how. So the basic premise here is that the more you move, the harder it is to aim, but the more survivable you become. So if you're moving in like a figure eight or left and right or moving all around, you become harder to hit, but at the same time, your own shots become harder to hit because you're moving like crazy. So what does this mean? So like, let's say you're playing Hela and you're playing an off angle. No one knows you're there. Your first couple of shots, good players will stand completely still. And the reason they do this is because they do not want to be more survivable. No one sees them. They want to be more lethal. So they want to stand completely still. And having that control to be able to be completely still. You start a target, you stand completely still, you try to hit that target. You stand completely still, you try to flick to the head to hit the target, right? You're trying to maximize your accuracy in the moments where you're not in a situation where you're taking damage. And in general, you want to move less or move in a very easily, adjustable way when you are not under threat. And what is an easy adjustable way? Like moving directly in one direction. If I'm playing Punisher, if I'm moving to the right in one direction, it's actually really easy for me to correct that and still aim perfectly straight because I'm moving in one direction at the same pace. Now, more importantly here, this means that against some matchups, moving doesn't really do anything for you, and your lethality is most important. So like, there are certain melee-based matchups where, like, I don't know, an Iron Fist is coming after you. Moving around is only going to make your shots harder. Moving around like crazy is not going to make it easier to kill the Iron Fist, and it's not actually decreasing his lethality. He's not missing any of his shots, but what everyone does every time an Iron Fist jumps on them is they start moving around like crazy. They start running away. They start jiggling left, right, jumping down, jumping. It's not going to help you. You're just going to miss all your abilities and all your shots. And I know that this is hard to do, to be calm under that pressure, but you got to understand that in that situation, the only thing that's going to keep you alive, or the only thing that's going to give you a chance to win the fight, is by being as accurate as possible. This means actually moving less in some cases, or not moving at all, and trying to actually hit your shots, hit your stuns, hit your cooldowns on a target to potentially kill them and win the matchup. And this is true for a number of different heroes, not just Iron Fist, but it is important to understand that movement doesn't always make you more survivable, and in a lot of cases, it just makes it harder for you to hit your cooldowns or your damage. Then number 6 is you can't hit anything. What should you do from here? You see, I've been in this exact situation where I felt like no matter how hard I tried, I was just not accurate. I was not consistent. I was not reliable. And this is what I would recommend you do to break through that. For one, create a routine where you're kind of doing the same practice routine every day. This could be aim training. This could just be practicing against the bots downstairs in the training room. This could be doing like a very specific bot routine where you're running around and killing bots. Whatever it is, create a routine that is challenging your aim, warming up your aim, and trying to build on that. Keep going and don't run away from the hard shots. I said that earlier, where you're trying to hit the hard shots. Even if that makes you worse, you got to try to hit those hard shots. And I really think the important thing here is as you're starting to develop your aim, practice your aim, getting better, getting more reps in, it's important to understand that you will not get better instantly. You really won't see a lot of results until you do all at once. I really like to compare it to like grains of sand, where you're kind of filling up an hourglass or a bucket. And only when you hit a large enough threshold do you see an actual raise in elevation, or you can actually see the progress that you've made. Like if you compared your aim yesterday to today after practicing, you're not gonna see any difference. Just like if you went to the gym, you're not gonna be jacked the next day. Like that's just not how it works, right? So I really can't stress enough what that repetition does, because I do remember looking at all these streamers and they were just like hitting shots that seems simple, but I was just like, I couldn't do that in a million years, even against bots. So they're just like hitting bots, and I was like, I can never do that. But eventually you can, and eventually you do, and eventually you start hitting shots that you're even impressed that you yourself hit, because before there was just no way you could ever hit them. And I want that for you, so stick with it, and I promise you'll see results. Now, the next thing that we got to talk about is inconsistencies in your aim. What do you do about your inconsistencies in your aim? And the first thing I need to tell you is that inconsistencies, to an extent, are inescapable, where they're always going to exist. Even like there are some days where I can literally not hit anything, and there's other days I'm actually hitting some pretty sick shots. Depending on the fraud footage my editor is putting up here, I might look like I'm hitting shots, I might look like I'm whiffing them, I don't know. And there's a lot of things that can affect my aim any given day. Rest, posture, caffeine, or just, you know, being warmed up, whatever it is, there's a lot of inconsistencies. However, you want to raise your ceiling higher and raise your floor higher. Still, even with my bad days of aim, I still have decent or reasonable enough aim where I can rely on my aim to a certain extent, and it's still not where I want to be. That's why I'm constantly trying to elevate my aim and aim train and get better. But the idea here is that you're moving that floor and you're moving that ceiling. There are going to be some, you know, plus or minus days, but the idea is that your floor is never close to what your floor was before. You're never going to take 5 shots and miss them all, right? You're going to hit some amount of those. And the higher you can raise that, the more you can rely on your mechanics. And the more you can rely on them, the more you can build plans around them, build positions around them, be consistent to an extent in your overall gameplay, and just be a better overall player. Another thing I would recommend is warm-up routine. And I'm going to be honest, this is where I kind of slack, and you should not slack. And this is where you have a legitimate warm-up routine where you're playing good on the characters you want to play, and you're mechanically warmed up to where you're playing reasonably, you know, maybe not perfectly warm or perfectly well, but you're good enough, like 90% of your normal aim, so that you're not throwing those games. Because I think a lot of players, they will just jump right in and they use their first like 4 or 5 games of the day to warm up their aim, and they're kind of throwing those games, and then they're playing well, but guess what? You already lost 4 games of the day. So even if you pop off with your aim and win the next 4, you're still like down. So that's definitely a bad habit, something that I need to fix as well. And then the last thing about consistency is try to have the same start position. This is a really, really important one. And I find that players that kind of feel like they're having an off day with their aim, you should stand up. You should readjust everything, your mouse, your keyboard, your mouse position, your chair position, your couch position, whatever, right? Stretch, sit back down in the same place, same start position that you always do. Because if you sit in a different angle, in a different spot, with a different posture, with a different distance from the monitor or mouse or whatever, any of that can cause inconsistencies. And so this is a really important thing to do. Create that same start position. Create consistency in everything else so that there will be consistency in your aim as well. But the last and maybe most important question that I get is, will you stop climbing if your aim is bad? And I will say that aim is one of the many factors in Rivals that make up you as a player. Aim can be super important, but it kind of depends on the heroes that you play. Aim is going to be more or less important depending on those heroes. And I do think that aim can help you play at a higher level than your understanding or your positioning, but it could also be the thing that is holding you back, where you have a higher understanding, a higher level of positioning than other people, but you're constantly losing games because your mechanical skill is holding you back. And I think that that's a very frustrating situation, because you consistently feel like you have the answers to the problems, but you still can't solve those problems. And that can be very, very important. This actually hurts people that are students of the game more so than others. So people that watch guide channels like mine are more susceptible to this problem. And that's why I think mechanics are really important to work on. This is why, relative to how much effort you're spending in trying to develop your game and understand the game and fix your positioning, you should also be putting in mechanical skill, because all 3 of the pillars, game sense, positioning, and mechanics, all work in tandem together to build you as a player. But if you have any questions about how to get better mechanical skill, I hope that this answered a lot of them, but let me know if there's any more in the comments down below. Definitely smash the like, subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much for coming by, and I'll see you next time.